So this is just to give you an idea of how quickly things are moving on this issue. This was a presentation that I originally put together in June of this summer to talk to an advocacy group called the Interfaith Immigration Coalition. And we're going to use this presentation to protect us from terrorism. They do a lot of work. Most of them are not child welfare experts. All right? And so you see children who have been apprehended. Most of them are male. Not all of them speak Spanish, and some of the children who we see, particularly from Guatemala, are not native Spanish speakers to begin with. They're indigenous language speakers. They speak Quiche or Mam or Mayan, okay? Maybe they recognize a little bit of Spanish, but it's very hard to ask a law enforcement officer, a Customs and Border Patrol officer, to say, I'd like you to patrol the border, I'd like you to pick up these kids, and then I want you to come back and switch roles. I want you to, you're still in uniform, but I want you to ask this 12-year-old girl about any sort of sexual trauma she encountered on this journey, and whether she's worried about returning because she's persecuted for her religion or she's experienced abuse of some sort or targeting. We at USCCB and many other advocates are really working on the screening aspect of what occurs in this Border Patrol station. And it is this screening area that is one of the most contentious points of all the stuff you're hearing about the news about the Trafficking and Victims Protection Act. Under the Trafficking and Victims Protection Act, these children are only supposed to be in this Border Patrol facility for 72 hours. Now, everybody here's seen the photos, right? This summer. I just want to ask a question. Many of you do a lot of, probably in management, other things. The Border Patrol facilities are obviously not meant to have children. You saw the photos of the large numbers of kids that are there. How do you think law enforcement officers who are supposed to be patrolling and doing this work were able to take care and do adequate screening for every one of those children you saw in those pictures within 72 hours? We're seeing problems with this system, okay? And this is an area, people are talking about it, but we need to change, and we also need to understand that people have needs, and we need to do better screening for these kids because they are a special need population. So from the screening, from Customs and Border Patrol, the children leave custody of the Department of Homeland Security, and they go to ORR. ORR is the Office of Refugee Resettlement. It is an office in the Department of Health and Human Services. This office houses social workers, legal aid, and foster care, family reunification experts like Marisa. They do work in terms of setting up a file for the child, biographical information about the child's journey, biographical information about the child's health, a discussion of an initial meeting with legal services within this office. At the same time, while they're in ORR shelter, okay, this is government money that's being spent to house these children. And it's very important that we understand that more and more when lawmakers are trying to make cuts to this system, they try and say that less time should be spent in the shelters. Currently, we're seeing 14 to 30 days in a shelter. Okay, that's another area of concern, I think, to many of the advocates, because try and put together, when we're looking at the volumes, a detailed profile and information to give an assessment about a child. That's a very big ask in terms of the time frame. But nonetheless, I think the people in ORR, they do a good job trying to set that up. Then they work on releasing to families. Okay, how many people here understand why they release to families? One of the things, this is the reason I'm asking, one of the things I'm always asked is, well, why are we releasing them to families if their families put them in this situation in the first place, and their families, let them be smuggled over? Well, the answer is that Well, not only is it a best practice, children should be with their family as opposed to being in an institutional government facility, it's also a cost-effective practice, okay? It's less expensive for the government to have children released to families with proper screening. Now, this is another area. What is the screening here? So we need to have screening of parents to ensure that there is a good, suitable place for the child while the immigration case is proceeding. Because every one of these kids who's come in has an immigration case. These children are not getting off, they're not gonna, disappear into the sunset. Under the United States immigration law and immigration code, they have illegally entered the United States. So while this proceeding is going on, a dual track of legal proceedings begins, where they are supposed to appear, they're supposed to present a case, get a lawyer, and do work like this. So the children are released to the family 90% of the time. 10% of the time, roughly 10% of the time, that is not a suitable option. Perhaps there is not a suitable family member. Perhaps there is no family member. Perhaps there's a situation where, maybe there's a situation of abuse or other things. So the children reside in foster care systems that are basically designed to do this. This is much less common, but USCCB also does programs relating to the care for these children in this situation.
Sometimes, actually, they have mental health problems that are so severe that the family is incapable of handling them, abuse or special needs.
Exactly. So what happens when the children are released to their family? Okay, this is where you guys start to come in and see firsthand. This is when the children are starting to enter the community. So maybe I am a 7-year-old from El Salvador, and I came in through the Rio Grande Valley Border Patrol sector, which is southern Texas. That's the majority of where the kids came from, okay? But my mom lives I'm from Florida, so we're going to use Florida. And my mom lives in Florida. My mom lives in Tampa. So the Rio Grande Valley Border Patrol is who originally took my case. Then I was transferred, and the facility I was transferred to was in San Antonio. Well, they're going to do some work in the OR facility in San Antonio, but I'm going to eventually, most likely, be sent to reunify with my mother, or my mom's going to come and get me. It depends on whatever's worked out. And I'm going to need to access the Tampa Bay school system and start to begin my immigration court case in the Tampa Bay immigration system, the federal system there. And this is where you're probably starting to see some of the community opposition or some of the difficulties. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the legal access to school for unaccompanied children. Okay, I'm going to do a plug. So BRICS, which is the Bridging Refugee Youth and Children's Services, they did a webinar that I'm going to send the link to. It is a 2-hour webinar about accessing school systems here, particular to here. I'm a lawyer, so I'm giving you some of the legal justifications, but this was a webinar that has social workers talking about the program. And I really suggest if you are assisting community members who are having difficulty getting their kids access to school, or children, you're assisting the children directly, that you take a look at this webinar because it has a lot of useful information. But the bottom line when we're talking about school access is these children have every right in the world to come to a public school, okay? There's no justification for them not to be able to do this. What a larger issue, and I believe your husband brought up the issue of what is a permissible form of identification that can be used to enroll the child in school. Okay. So I have a list just here of what's permissible and what's impermissible. So under United States federal government, what's impermissible is things that would point out nationality. okay, or alienage. So this would be a birth certificate, because obviously a child coming from here would not have a birth certificate from the United States, okay? Another example is a social security number. These children do not have social security numbers. What is permissible and what will be a requirement are documents demonstrating residency, all right? Because schools, as you know, take their funding from the districting and who lives where, and that's how they make some of their enrollment decisions. So this is something that if you need, to show a proof of, for the biographical information for enrollment, that is something that is permissible to include. Okay, the other thing I would say is, and this will be a theme for some of this, some of it is negotiating a local relationship. Some of you, have relationships with the schools or with the school board in the area, and some of it is bringing up the fact that there are resources available for ESOL students, language acquiring skills, and other things, and programs relating to that. There was a question last time about an older child, a 16 or 17-year-old who maybe was not at a 16 or 17-year-old level, and did we have to encourage them to go to school? Yes, they're required to go to school. What you can suggest, and this is where you being a local advocate will be super helpful, is there are programs, and there are tiny programs and bigger programs of special programs for students in this situation, okay? There are advanced language acquisition programs for students who have come here who maybe do not have they have 3 or 4 years of formal schooling, but they're 16 years old. And this is a matter of accessing and speaking to the administrators and recognizing that they are supposed to be providing these programs, and that they, I think in most cases will upon some discussion. So the next, all right. So the next point, just about relating.
Been dealing with that for a long time. So they, especially in this area, most of the systems do have programs set up for kids that they know are not going to graduate from high school, but they're of an age where it's still mandatory to assist school, and they try to get them language schools or maybe some type of skills training.
Yeah.
So you might have to, investigate what's available at the local particular school, but it is there.
Yeah. So the next element, in addition to enrolling kids in school, and they've got community support with churches and advocates like you guys, is their legal case, okay? So basically, their legal case began here when they were apprehended, and they were given what's known as an NTA, a notice to appear, and a notice about their actions. And normally, hopefully, with ORR, they have filed a change of venue to where the parent is going to be, all right, to that court. Because right now, with the exception of 1 or 2 pilot programs that are being run out of Texas, there's a disconnect between where the child is first documented to be an illegal entrant to the United States and filed into that court versus where the child ends up with the parent. Okay. So, one of the questions was about the life of an immigration case, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So, we're here, we filed the change of motion venue, okay, and we're now we're going to use my fictitious 7-year-old El Salvador in Tampa. So she now has a responsibility to appear in the immigration court in Tampa. What happens? Well, there's basically 3 stages. The first is the initial master calendar hearing, okay? In the master calendar hearing, the court does not normally address any legal claims or defenses. It's more an issue of stating your nationality, acknowledging the charges that are brought against you, an issue of whether there's counsel or not. And maybe perhaps you can schedule another one based on a continuance. All right, this comes to another crucial advocacy point that is very hard to deal with these children is these children are not entitled to legal representation in the United States. All right, because immigration court and immigration laws for the most part are civil in nature, the United States government does not give legal representation for civil matters in most instances. So these children really are on their own to find legal counsel. All right, this is where pro bono comes in. All right, So I am a lawyer. I do a fair amount of policy work. I have some pro bono cases that I'm working on now that are these unaccompanied kids. But another thing that's very important for you as a community is to recognize that there's a real need for legal services for these kids. And if you know lawyers or people who are interested in just preparing some of the initial casework, assisting with a deposition on some of this, all the help that can be provided should be provided, because very often what happens, particularly now, is you will see a 6 or 7-year-old coming before an immigration judge with a government prosecutor, a grown-up prosecuting. The child doesn't speak English, and frankly, it's heartbreaking. And it's not, I think, what is part of our, what we had in mind for a legal system.
Do the lawyers need to have the language, the Spanish?
The lawyers don't normally have to have the Spanish. There's normally translation provided in the court. A lawyer who is working with a child like this would probably need to have translation relating to the affidavits and the depositions of the child giving their story, because they need to apply for forms of relief. So we're lining up good. What are the available forms of relief for these kids? Okay, so there's 4 forms of relief that we're seeing now. One is asylum, which, as many of you know, it is when you have a fear of persecution that is based upon your ethnicity, your religion, your race, a particular social group. Asylum is very difficult for these children to access. A lot of the courts do not have child-friendly asylum policies. It's on a circuit court by circuit court basis. There's no established law yet on this. The Supreme Court has not formally taken this up. So it's a roll of the dice in many ways. You may be in a jurisdiction, or you may be with a judge who is very child-friendly and asks very child-centric questions. For asylum cases, it's very difficult also for these children, because there's been a lot of case law that has proven that individuals coming from these countries fleeing gang violence don't have as good of a shot as other individuals facing persecution. There's a T visa, which is a trafficking visa. This is for children who are victims of trafficking. Women, men, children who are victims of trafficking. There are some trafficking cases that occur. A more common, and the third one, is a U visa, which is a visa that is given to victims of crimes. There's enumerated crimes. This one, maybe you don't comply with the definition of a trafficking victim, but maybe you were the victim of an assault of some sort, or maybe you were the victim of a robbery or an attempted murder. These are things that are enumerated under the statute. I think one of the drawbacks of this is it requires a law enforcement certification, which could be difficult sometimes with children who need to cooperate with a law enforcement officer. The final form of relief is what's known as SIJS, Special Immigrant Juvenile Status. SIJS, I have a handout on SIJS and I forgot it, so I will send it to everybody. But SIJS is basically it's a designation that a child has been abused or has been abandoned by a parent, and is eligible if they proceed and follow the criteria normally for legal permanent residency. This is the most common form of relief, but the lawyers are going to call it SIJS, because we all love our acronyms. So just to go back to the case, so at the initial master calendar hearing, you're supposed to give your nationality, what's going on relating to this, and hopefully you've secured legal counsel. If you haven't, if they haven't, this is the time that they need to start looking for counsel. From there, the case goes to an individual merits hearing, and this is where these claims of relief that I discussed are brought up. After that, this is when the child has the opportunity to speak to a judge and go through. After that is the post-relief action or the appeals from...
What's the time length in between the first master hearing and the merit?
Okay, good question. Right now it's changing, okay? So for a while, these children were Okay, just to back up, the immigration court is very backlogged. All right, there are, in certain jurisdictions, there are delays up until like 2018 for the processing of cases. There hasn't been a lot of extensive funding to immigration courts and the provision of immigration judges, and the cases in the last 2 years of the Bush administration, during the Obama administration, there's been a great increase in pursuing immigration-related crimes and prosecuting on this thing. So it's resulted in a real ramping up of the cases with the resources kind of staying steady. Due to the pressure from this summer, these children were part of those dockets normally, and they were processed when they were processed, and so they ended up spending a lot of time with their parents. Due to the pressure from this summer, certain jurisdictions began what is known as a rocket docket. Okay, so this is when the court has some discretion for its timing of rules, in terms of it has certain rules it needs to follow, but there's discretion as to whether it gives extensions, whether it allows more time for you to get your case together to find a lawyer. And these cases are increasingly being processed very quickly. Okay, for example, I know in Texas, in Dallas, and also in Baltimore, and I know in Florida, there are documented cases of rocket dockets, meaning sometimes children will come for their initial master calendar hearing, and the 6 months that they maybe were given before to come back for their merits hearing now becomes 21 days. So what are the obstacles? I think they're pretty obvious. A lot of times the kids or their parents have not secured legal representation, all right? So in addition to having to secure legal representation, these cases are paperwork intensive, all right? There's a lot of work that goes involved. There's a lot of fact finding, particularly for an asylum case. You have to have a lot of information that's given. For the special immigrant juvenile visa cases, it's more a matter, because you're dealing with the family court and the state and the immigration court, it's more a matter of coordinating. That being said, normally these are not cases that, without a lawyer, you're likely going to successfully access. So it's very concerning to us that they're continuing to fast track this, and we have discussed that it's an issue of due process that we're worried about. So I want to raise one more point about the children when they're in their immigration court proceeding. There was a question last time about the first one, or any time the children are with their parents, they come to the immigration court. Somebody asked me a question about whether parents most of these parents are undocumented. We know this. Whether the parents who are undocumented, who are assisting the children and bringing them to their immigration court proceedings, whether they would be subject to enforcement themselves by the local police or ICE, Immigration Custom Enforcement, while they're in the courthouse. So I gave an answer that was actually correct. I just wanted to review it. So the deal is that there's no formal policy or statement that ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, will not pursue at courts of law. Okay? One of the issues here is that local police, for local courts, have been known to pursue, undocumented people who come in to pay for a parking ticket, or they come to pick up something. Federal courts, we've not seen that as much. There is the Department of Homeland Security Immigration and Customs Enforcement issues what's known as memos. And there was a memo from October 2011 that spoke about this, and it's entitled The Enforcement Actions at Sensitive Locations. The sensitive locations that have been identified by the Department of Homeland Security that they will never pursue undocumented people except in exigent circumstances are schools, churches and places of worship, hospitals, sites where there's protests and demonstrations, and then sites where there's funerals, weddings, or family events like baptisms. Now, the exception when they will pursue this is if there's a national security concern, an imminent risk of death, An imminent risk of destruction of evidence or enforcement involves immediate pursuit, meaning somebody who they were in pursuit of walks into a church where there's a wedding going on and there's many undocumented people. So I was in a meeting yesterday and there was a discussion about the updates of this policy and specifically whether courts were included. The ICE officers have been, this policy has been reviewed and they have decided to not include courts at this time. So there's no guarantee that that will not happen. I think there's an unofficial policy that they, in most federal courts, so immigration court jurisdictions, they do not come after the parents. However, we don't have anything really more legal to hang our hat on at this point.
Do you have numbers, any idea of how many are sent back initially, first or second court, third court, last court?
Yes, I do have numbers. Okay, just to give you an idea.
And is it because of the system or is it because they have a history?
All right, well, that's a very good question because it's a little bit of both sometimes. All right, kids who have, first off, to give you an idea of the backlog of the immigration court. So from 2005 to 2014, there were 101,850 juvenile immigration cases filed. So that's these children, all right? There are currently pending 41,000 of those cases. Yeah. So the juvenile cases that are pending, the 41,641 cases, they only represent 11% of the entire immigration court docket. Because in total, there are 378,000 immigration cases proceeding in the United States right now. 78,000. So when people say to you that these children are taxing our immigration system more than anybody else, that's just patently false. There's no reason that these kids would need to have their case expedited, except for it makes it more difficult to find an attorney. And children who do not have an attorney have about a 40% more likely chance of being sent back and not having relief. Either they are sent back, they're what's known as expedited removal, so the government has made a decision that they have illegally entered, they do not have any form of relief, and they must leave, or they voluntarily leave themselves, voluntary removal, where the child elects to take themselves out of the immigration proceeding and go home, repatriate, without having any sort of immigration consequences. But I pose to you, the parents in the room, how many children do you know that would elect to, after making a treacherous journey like this, on their own to pack up and leave? So again, it's a little bit in flux.
So if they go to that merits hearing, where they present their case,
Yeah.
is their decision made at that time?
No, there can be, but there does not have to be.
Okay. So what is the time frame, and then what happens after that?
So if they're granted relief on one of these cases, they get to proceed into basically moving forward into legal permanent residency.
Okay.
All right, because these statuses are vehicles to moving forward. And if they're not, they normally are sent back. They're repatriated.
But does somebody come to their address and pick them up and take them within X period of time, or are they told to present themselves somewhere?
They're told to present themselves. There have been instances where they are taken upon custody. That's not always the practice. They're frequently told to present themselves and come. Some do, some don't. We don't have any statistics on this, and this is one of the big issues that's coming right now.
So if they don't, if they say, well, I'm not going back, and they change addresses and then
They're living a life of being undocumented in the shadows.
Yeah.
So,
So at some time in the future, if they're picked up, it would be for whatever.
if they were picked up by ICE, the Immigration Customs Enforcement, or they were picked up by local police that had what's known as a secure communities or a 287G agreement, so police with the federal, the computer would come up, they would put up the information, and there would be an outstanding warrant, and a hold would be put on this individual. Most likely, if it's a child, it's not as easy to detain them in a local jail or prison. If they became an adult, they aged out, they would probably be held if it was a jurisdiction that had a relationship with ICE, until ICE could come and pick them up and detain them and deport them. It's it's very sad. So, yeah.
Those numbers you just gave, help me understand. You said there's like 378,000 cases already in the process. Is that right?
There's a total of for this year, or the total numbers?
The total number over what time frame?
From 2005 to 2014, there were roughly 101,000 cases that have been filed, juvenile immigration cases, so UAC cases. Okay, 41,000 of them are currently pending.
Currently pending, what does that mean? Being worked on?
Yes.
Okay, so they still have 60,000 to deal with.
They've resolved 60,000.
Oh,
40,000.
so there's only 40,000.
But just to give you,
From 2005.
yeah, well,
So all these new ones then are they're 30,000 of the 41,000?
well, so this is where the rocket docket comes in. I have the numbers for as of June. This is June, of the end of June of this year. There were 19,670 cases filed this year. So, and then 18,600 of them are pending. So we're seeing a much faster, apprehension, custody, and then legal processing to try and get the kids out.
Of the 60, go ahead.
Pending means they're in the legal process.
Yes.
So they're still protected. Of the 60,000, do you have any idea of how many were sent back?
I actually have the numbers on this. Okay. Here we go. So, of the 60,000, 29,000 of them received a they've divided the numbers into attorney and no attorney. This is TRAC, which is it's through the Syracuse University, and they take all the U.S. Immigration Court information and they digest it down. I'll include it as a link if you want. It's a very useful thing. So the way that they've divided it here is about half and half. The 60,000, we have 29,000 that did not have an attorney, and 31 that did. Of the 29,000 that didn't have an attorney, 77% received a removal order. Of the 31,000 who did have an attorney, 28% received a removal order. And so it's clear that the need for legal services, I'll send this. It's got some great information.
When you get a removal statement, what actually happens? Does somebody accompany these children back to their country?
Yes. If the children who are voluntarily removed or deported are normally flown back, and they are flown back, they used to be flown back commercially. Increasingly, ICE rents out private planes to do it, and they fly them back. We have been working, one of the big issues, and this is something when we think about this issue, is not just US, one of the big issues is these kids come back, okay, so you come back, let's take my 7-year-old from El Salvador. She comes back, mom has probably paid $2,000 to $7,000 to get her up to the United States, all right? She is brought back to the airport. She may not live, her and her family may not live anywhere near the airport, right? She may live hours and hours away. This is particularly the case in Guatemala, all right? A lot of the kids come from the highlands, the indigenous areas, and it's very far away from Guatemala City. It's 7 or 8 hours. So these kids come back. The family is financially ruined by this effort, all right? Because the child was not able to make it up. they maybe mortgaged their home or did something else to try and come up with the money, and the family has to come many hours to come and get the child. And it's a very sad, I think, experience. And one of the things that USCCB is working on is a repatriation program, working with Catholic Relief Services to help facilitate what happens when the kids are turned back, because not all of these kids are going to qualify for immigration relief, okay? Some of them just will not comply, all right? And some will. But the children that don't, obviously were fleeing for a reason and need assistance when they return so they don't re-migrate and they don't do this again. And it's a big concern, and it's a problem when we think about advocacy strategies for the Hill here to try and get people to give more money and more program support to looking at root causes, looking at gang prevention programs, looking at education programs that teach kids. Maybe they teach them Spanish and not English because they speak an indigenous language and they don't live in a community that would speak English. Maybe teaching them better coffee production, things that are actually going to be useful in the community that they live in. And this is something that, I think it's a very important aspect of looking at this population and looking at a realistic, regional, and holistic solution.
Who made the decision to return these kids on private aircraft?
Well, I think given the volume, private airplanes were used by ICE to deport adults. And I think you have to understand, when ICE looks at this, yes, there's a lot of private contractors, but when ICE looks at these, they see it as a logistics thing, all right? So they look at their detention facilities and they look at the number of beds they have, and they look at the space, the number of buses they have and flights. And so it becomes, I think, less of a, I don't think that there's as much emphasis on what the cost to the taxpayer is, as much as getting the flow and getting the systems going.
I understand that, and I suspected that was the case.
Yeah.
And that taxpayer money could I think, be much better spent facilitating the cases and a more just treatment on the border. Who's advocating for that?
The Catholic churches. We'll get to the detention, because if you're really gonna, hair stands on edge with the cost for the immigrant detention system as we have it today. It's crazy.
Ashley, you said that the most common form of relief was the SIJ Act.
Yes.
Now, how do these kids come up here with whatever kind of papers, formal, legal, or whatever, which have to be presented when they present their case? How do you prove that they have been abused or abandoned or whatever the other qualifiers are?
So some of them travel actually with their birth certificate, which I think that they know the process, and this has been something that they've done. Sometimes they lose those documents. There's a process which you can go and talk to the consular offices, in some of the major metropolitan areas to try and track down this information, about relating to the birth certificate. Relating to the family and the abandonment, they have to get a certification from the family court, the state court in which the caretaker is residing, all right?
In this country, or
in this country, to get a special immigrant juvenile status in this country.
That's because their parent lives here.
Yes.
So they have to go to that jurisdiction to get a document saying that they're not a fit parent, basically.
So this is
Parents have to prove they abandoned.
a parent, one of the, so they can still live with the caretaking parent, but a different parent or a different situation of abuse occurred, all right? This highlights a good point. This is not a best child welfare practice because it doesn't focus on a focus of family reunification. However, it is becoming the best way to get these children status. Now, there's a lot of case law about whether the parents can, the child can not reunify, but in some ways formulate a relationship again with the parent who's been designated, and it is mixed. Again, I have the background, and I'm sorry I forgot it, but I'll send it, and it's got all the points, point by point.
Thank you.
Of course. So this has been a big week for family detention. So in addition to the 66,000 children that came up this summer, there are 66,000 families that family members that came up as well, which is just not publicized. What am I talking about? I'm talking about families from the same country, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, primarily female-led households. Children they normally have 2 to 3 children and normally under the age of 12. These women are coming for many reasons that are similar to the children. One of the big reasons that they're coming is also domestic violence and persecution relating to that. So when the families started coming, first off, I just will give a little data point. In April of 2014, we used to do family detention. The United States government engaged in family detention, and there was a facility in Texas called Hutto, and it was closed by the Obama administration because it was the subject to a big lawsuit by the ACLU. It was really criticized as really not an appropriate facility for children. So starting in 2009, the Obama administration did not have a policy about family detention. They had one family detention facility in York, Pennsylvania. It had 96 beds. This was the status quo until April 2014. April 2014 is when we started seeing the numbers of the kids and the families arriving at the border. The Border Patrol, I think somewhat overwhelmed with the kids, didn't know what to do with these family members who are treated differently. They do not have the protection of the Trafficking and Victims Protection Act. They don't have any sort of process that they must go through like the children from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. Initially, the United States government, the Department of Homeland Security, was releasing these families and giving them NTAs, notice to appear, at wherever their final destination was. The Border Patrol also relied on faith-based communities. A very good example of this was in El Paso. There's a man, Ruben Garcia. He works with Annunciation House. He's Catholic. He has been working with migrant families for about 25 years. He has a very good ad hoc relationship with the local ICE office there. And he received quite a bit of families that he was through his faith-based network, and that community was able to find housing for them as they moved on to where they were going. He contacted the bishops of Las Cruces, New Mexico, Bishop Cantu and Bishop Ramirez. They also set up facilities. They were a cooperating jurisdiction. The facility that they set up was in one of their parishes, and it was basically has beds. It had an area for a shower. They collected clothes. They had phone banks for people to call and receive information, and nobody stayed there about more than 36 hours. So these are examples of communities where, releasing families worked. An example where releasing families didn't work, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, is Phoenix, Arizona, where the governor reported about ICE dropping individuals off at a bus station and what was happening. The Obama administration, I think, received quite a bit of pushback from that and went from releasing them and giving individuals a notice to appear to starting a policy of the ankle monitors. From ankle monitors, they still felt that this was not going to be enough of a deterrence. So in June, the government announced its plans to build a family detention facility for 700 beds in Artesia, New Mexico. Okay, Artesia, New Mexico, I went on the tour, is 3 hours away from any sort of facility. It's 3 hours away from El Paso, from Albuquerque. It is a former CBP training facility, and it is in the middle of the desert. This was the first bed that they built. Then they took a facility at the end of that month, and they refashioned it for family detention. It's called Carnes. It's in Texas. This is an additional 600 facility bed. Earlier this week, the government announced it is building, along with the Corrections Corporation of America, a private contractor, a 2,400-bed facility for families in Dilley, Texas. So it'll be done at the end of the month. So just to give you a frame of reference, we had 96 beds in April of 2014. In October of 2014, we're going to have 3,000 family detention immigration beds, with a projection of probably another 3,000 more if the Obama budget request goes through. I went to Artesia. I will say that I understand that it was set up as a facility momentarily, but there are serious concerns relating to housing children in detention facilities. The average age of the children that were there was 6 years old. One of the things I think that was most disturbing, there's still no school facility in Artesia, so these kids have no school. But one of the things I think that was most disturbing is in these facilities, you're supposed to have what's known as a legal orientation program. In Artesia, there was no legal orientation program for the first month. We know for a fact that 3 planefuls of people went back to El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala without receiving any sort of legal orientation. They were summarily returned. Another disturbing thing is there's a full set of asylum officers there, but all of the proceedings are on video camera. It's a 22-inch screen, and this is how these women proceed for their cases. There's no child care at Artesia. So if you're a woman who's pursuing an asylum claim, you need to speak to the asylum officer with your child close by to you as you explain the horrific abuse of why you would be eligible for asylum. It's another problem. So one of the things that I think we're most concerned about is currently, the United States immigration detention system, not including families, costs taxpayers $2 billion a year. All right? Detention beds cost anywhere from $122 to $160 a day. All right? Alternatives to detention programs can cost as little as 19 cents and cost up to about $60 a day, and they're normally considered better. Well, it seems like it's a slam dunk, right? Not so fast. We have what's known as, there's a pamphlet here, the detention bed mandate. So this is basically, it's a line of language in the appropriations bill that says that we must have a floor, a minimum of 34,000 beds in this country occupied at all times. So over half of the facilities that we're talking about are owned and operated by 2 main private prison contractors, GEO Corporation and CCA, Corrections Corporations of America. In the past 5 years, these companies have seen their profits triple almost every year. Bless you. Dilley, Texas, the facility that was discussed, the opening, is a CCA facility. We're very concerned about family detention, obviously, especially because it doesn't seem that it's going to be letting up. The USCCB has an alternatives to detention program that they're working on. And USCCB was asked personally by Immigration and Customs Enforcement to work on finding individuals like yourself who would be willing to give short-term refuge to some of these people and enable them to comply. We have not, after scaling up a small network, we were told that this would not be needed, ostensibly because they'd probably already built the detention beds. This is where we're at with the family immigration. I'm sure there's a lot of questions as to why somebody has an ankle bracelet, why somebody goes to be detained, why somebody's released. And the answer is, I don't have an answer. There isn't an answer. It seems that certain decisions are made purely on availability and chance. If there's an available detention bed and there's a family that fits the pattern for the available beds, people go into the detention facility. If an individual comes into a border patrol and is going to a different part of the country, they're possibly given an ankle monitor. We have yet to get a straightforward answer as to why this is happening. The only thing the administration will admit is that a lot of these immigrants, the adults, have the ability sometimes to post a bond and come out on release. The White House has decided that all families coming from the Rio Grande Valley, that's where they came in South Texas, from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, will not be granted bond. So they will be detained. And has admitted on the record that they are using this family detention as a means of deterring migration and sending a message to other families that come. I urge you all to speak to your congressman to write nasty, angry letters opposing the construction of this facility. I will say to you, they came out with the numbers yesterday about the children. There's 1,050 children that have been detained in Carnes, Artesia, and Berks. 55% of them are under the age of 5. And it's only getting worse. I wish I could, I wish I had something better to say. I mean, we're working very hard on this issue, but it seems to be moving in a direction that, it looks like family detention is here to stay for a little bit.
You said it, but I missed it. What's the alternative to this?
There's different forms of alternatives to detention. So there's a whole range of options. So for example, the Department of Homeland Security itself has a policy called ISAP, which is basically a call-in. The purpose of detention originally was people were not showing up for their court proceedings. So the government said, we're going to detain them to make sure that they don't abscond, right? But some of these programs have really high rates of compliance, okay? People will call in. That's the cheapest option. Then there's what we at USCCB is working on, a community support model. That's taking your refugee resettlement model and saying we're going to provide support for you as you wait for the pendency of your immigration case. Again, not everybody's going to comply and get an immigration relief, but there is no reason for people to be detained in such inhumane settings while they, ride out their case. There's a variety of different options, and almost all of them are more cost-effective than federal immigrant detention systems. I could talk to you about the conditions, but really it's the practice that's most disturbing, that these families are obviously leaving for a reason, and that they are being detained kind of to send a message. And it's just, I think, not really reflective of what our values are.
So now they are detained while the whole process is going on. At first you said it was supposed to just maybe take place for 36 hours.
Yeah.
Now it could be for years.
These are the children, but the families, but the idea is very similarly, they want them out of there. So the problem is that we're seeing that they're getting processed really quick, and guess what? The first 200 families coming out of Artesia, there was a 2% acceptance rate for credible fear asylum applicants. 2%.
So it's just a transition station.
So they have their master hearing in Artesia.
Detained. But they appear before a TV that was in Arlington, Virginia.
Okay, but that's like somebody else would go and it would be their initial interview.
Yes.
And then do they also have a merits hearing?
Yeah, I mean, they have a merits hearing. They've normally, the first part of, if you're applying for, they're mostly applying for asylum. And if you're applying for asylum, you have what's known as a credible fear. And if you fail the credible fear, you don't move forward. So let me put it to you this way. We're talking about how difficult for the children to get a legal representation in the community, children that attend churches like yours, whatever. Imagine if you're a Guatemalan woman detained in Artesia, New Mexico. You are going to be, your case is going to be heard in a matter of days. You don't speak English. There's a list of 5 or 6 attorneys. Actually, the El Paso Diocese is providing them. I mean, you're not going to get counsel. And you're basically going to go through an interview process that, frankly, you're unprepared to do. Your child may be sitting on your lap as you explain what's happening. And some of the women themselves have refused. They have just compromised their own cases because they say, I'm not going to discuss this in front of my child. yeah, it's very disheartening.
So the faster they try to fast track these cases, the more are getting deported.
Yes. So, and then what I would also say to you is there's an aspect of this, the random chanceness of it. So I heard a story when I was in Artesia about how there was two planes. The Border Patrol had two planes that they had detained of families. This was in July. One, the Border Patrol, when they were screening and doing the paperwork, had messed up. That is the plane that stayed and was taken back to El Salvador, and the other plane, they were put into detention facility. It was basically based on an administrative error. So, I mean, right now, I think one of the big issues is voicing opposition and saying because yes, the children with the unaccompanied children, it's very serious and it does need a lot of help, and you need to help provide community support. But we're in the midst of truly an immigration, family detention kind of moment here. We are building up, and frankly, it's going to be on the backs of taxpayers. Because, you have private prison contractors who it's going to be their mission to learn how to retrofit facilities so they're child friendly.
Okay, Ashley, that's the group that's in detention, and, we can write letters to our congressmen that way, and of course they're at a distance from us. And then there's this whole other group that we're seeing here, specifically, it's come to our attention through the need for transportation.
Yes.
Having to get people up to Baltimore for their court hearings, having to get people to Baltimore for their weekly, bi-weekly, 3 times a week, bracelet checks. Is there any way we can do advocacy around that? What would be the best way to try to, get some, what they call the community support model, or at least put some of these, at least try to get them so that there's a time. I mean, this one, some cases spend hours there. Plus, there's no place for people to stay outside. Family takes them and they're in the street, which is okay right now, but when the weather gets bad.
And yesterday, the person that we thought was going to ICE ended up going to Hopkins Plaza instead. So we're never sure where somebody's supposed to go. This is another thing,
But But basically, who can we, is there a person, place?
Well, so one of the other issues, like kind of what I was talking about with the randomness of some of the decisions, is that there are, it's called AOR, an area of responsibility. This is how ICE refers to its operations. An AOR is the area of responsibility, and every AOR has an FOD, a field office director, and this field office director is making all of the decisions on the local level. They're checking in with headquarters, okay? So for example, yesterday I went to an ICE headquarters meeting, and I will speak to headquarters about this, but when we run our community service ATD program, we're operating out of Boston and Baton Rouge, and we are working with 2 AORs, FODs, okay? And so those decisions are made there. Now, there is a further line of communication, but it's very important to get that type of information. I will follow up with you. This I've not been able to do, but I will follow up with you about who your FOD is and what the situation is. But a lot of it, at this point, what happens is that some decision has been made based on the logistics of what's available, and then some decisions have been made based on, they have what's known as a risk assessment tool. Okay. Now these families don't always comply with that system. They're normally detained because of where they came from. They came from El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, when they came this summer, and the fact that they came from the Rio Grande Valley Border Patrol facility, they normally are just put on ankle or detained. Okay. But other ones will go through a risk assessment, and it's an algorithm that they use to decide detain, release, ankle bracelet, and whatnot. We don't know the criteria of what the risk assessment is. It's a big mystery. But what I will say is, local advocacy, just discussing who you are. Faith-based is the most effective, okay? I work with a lot of great people at ACLU and other places, and they have a great position in terms of bringing legislation and bringing lawsuits on this, but faith-based in terms of advocating at the local level is most effective with a lot of these law enforcement officers. I will follow up and I'll get you the name, and we'll see what we can do. I wish I had something more to give you, but a lot of it is basically relationship building and trying to do persuasion.
Ashley?
Yeah.
Today, I had to work with a gentleman. He had to bring something like $6,000 in cashier's checks to the federal building because he wants to get his daughter up. She's been in Texas for 3 months.
It's her bond.
How do they determine the amount of money? I mean, this man probably doesn't see $6,000 in half of the year or more.
The bond for the women in Artesia is $15,000. The idea is to not, they don't want to do bond, and the couple instances they've done is very high. How they determine bond is, again, another thing that they have not disclosed, and it's based on regional a little bit. Also, it may depend on the fact that she's being released means that that's a good sign in terms of, yeah, because not everybody can make it out of, not everybody even gets a bond hearing.
She's somewhere in Texas, I think.
Where in Texas? Do you have the A number?
No, I don't have it.
Okay. That would be when her A number is a number that she is given. It's a number that you can use to track where she is. He might have it, and there's a database that you can use on the DHS website, and it's helpful to look at where things are. It's basically like her social security number according to DHS. ICE will not pay USCCB to transport somebody who they've identified in a different area of responsibility, AOR, to come to our facility. The church pays to transport that person, even though it's an ICE designated person who is entering a program in our custody. So no, they're not going to pay. They don't pay for their own people who are, tallied in our custody. They're I think they have the capacity that we've talked about with the planes, but they don't pay.
The state of Maryland have any role in this? Here we apparently have 2,800 unaccompanied children.
Yes.
Living in Maryland, and yet we're dealing directly with ICE. Do we get any assistance, help, guidance from the state?
Well, ICE doesn't deal with the children. ICE deals with you may be dealing with children of the families. The families are ICE, but the children that's who we're enrolling in school. That's who, we're trying to work within the community with the parent who they're here because one of their parents lives here.
So they are dealing with Maryland
Social Services, Maryland School Board. They're dealing with the, I think it's the 4th Circuit Immigration Court. They're dealing with the Maryland School Board. They're dealing with the Maryland Social Service. Yeah.
Did you get the email that Beth would send out after, there was a meeting this week, I guess, with the Maryland's Department of Human Services, and what they put together is an open source website that helps to identify where services are available for these children and their families.
Oh, that's great.
It's under Uscondo, Maryland, it's called. Uscondo, Maryland.
I did look at that.
And it's got, it's really pretty, and it's in the process, initially developed, and then it's going to be ongoing, be updated.
So my other question was, okay, if there are 2,800 unaccompanied children in the state of Maryland, does Maryland know where they are?
Yes.
They do. The state does. They have an address because they've been released to family.
And the ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, has been in contact with the state liaison and has discussed it. Do they know everything? No, but they know that they're here.
They know they're here.
I'll tell you about that.
Okay. Well, I guess, in another related activity, we were talking about, well, if we wanted to give any kind of additional support to these unaccompanied children.
Yeah.
For example, going to school requires having clothing, winter's coming. Now, if we had donations, how would we get our help to that child?
I know that our children's services created information about resources that you can contribite to and ideas that you can do community related. And then I'm sure within Maryland there's specific programs. I'll give you the sheet of what I have. I'm less familiar about the linkages on that side, but I'll give you what I have. And I'm sure that we work with people, yeah?
This gentleman came into the Langley Park office 2 weeks ago and presented the secretary with that paper and said he needs a ride to Baltimore. And this is what happens. Somebody calls and says, I need to go to Baltimore. At least he had that paper. Sometimes we don't even know what point in the process they're at. We're not sure which place to take them in Baltimore. And if we don't have an interpreter with them, it's really hard.
Here, if you can see, so he came in through, go to the next page. He came in through Tucson, all right? So he was paroled in. This is the charge that is against him. This is what he violated, all right? There was a family unit, so obviously him and the son came together.
All it is letters and
This is
and little letters and numbers. There's no word.
This is the code. This is section 212. I'll give you the explanation. This is okay. So he came in here. And then he was paroled here. Was part of a family unit. This is the number. This is his biographical information that he gave.
That I got.
And this is, his kind of makeshift notice to appear. But so he did get a calendar.
March 15th.
Okay,
So
an
we're
initial here.
planning transportation to that end.
When do they get the A number?
They get the A number when they're apprehended by the Department of Homeland Security.
We get the A number, let's say in Texas.
Yes.
So if we get the website and we get the A number, we can actually see the case and the status of it.
In theory, yes. However, there are people who they lose, and there are people who, for example, the women in Artesia, there's been a lot of complaints that their A numbers are not showing up. In theory, you can look this up, and he probably will be on there because he's not a special population, it seems. The Department of Homeland Security includes ICE, which is Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, CBP, which is Customs and Border Patrol, BP, which is Border Patrol, and ERO, Enforcement Removal Operations. They run the detention facilities. And then we have the legal side, which is ER, Executive Office of Immigration Removal. Alphabet soup. The other thing, and this is important, I think most of you know, so the Department of Homeland Security is a baby organization in terms of when we think about departments. It's only been around for about 13 years? And it's a group of hodgepodge things that have been pushed together. One of the things I will say, I work a lot with CBP, Customs Border Patrol, and I work a lot with ICE. They don't even necessarily always gel administratively and other things. And so you do find sometimes some gaps, maybe not as consistent use of an A number or things like that. This is a mission report that we took with, the USCCB took with Bishop Seitz of El Paso, and this was a report we wrote about the kids in November of last year and about what they were doing. I can send you a link to that. This is my email, afeasley@usccb.org.
Excuse me, we didn't talk about the master hearing.
Yes, I'm sorry. So sorry. So the master calendar hearing is like the initial hearing. You don't have to have a defense at this. You basically, they ask for your nationality, they read the charge against you. In this case, it was the 212 D5, I think. That's the section of the code that he violated according to the United States government. They ask you, you know, is that you? Did you do that? And you say yes. Are you planning to mount a defense? And you say yes. And that's it.
Is that for children as well? Does it
Yes.
have a master hearing?
Yes.
And then the second one is called a merit.
You can get a continuance on your master calendar hearing, but most of the time, the next is a merits hearing. Yeah. And so it's very important to show up for the master calendar hearing because you don't want to be deported in absentia. If you don't show up, the government assumes you're not contesting it, and I mean, you can recover from that and you can appeal that. It's much more difficult once you get yourself into that category.
And the second one, the merits hearing, that's one that's really important to bring a lawyer to.
Yes. Because this is your chance, this is our due process, right? This is when you get a chance to speak to the judge about what your grounds of cancellation for your removal is.
So where do people find these pro bono lawyers?
Universities do a lot of it. You have a lot of law clinics that do it. You have, right now, there's a bunch of lawyers that are doing pro bono at commercial firms. Try CAIR Coalition, CAIR. They do work with this population. Catholic Studies does it. I know that they have special, I think that they are standing up just children's docket lawyers. A big one who has been great is an organization called KIND, Kids in Need of Defense, and they link up pro bono lawyers with people. Catholic U, I teach there, but they have a newer immigration clinic, but it's small, and if you have some more ones that have more experience who are taking that few, then you're probably not going to get. I'll check with, I know the woman who does the clinical, I'll get back to you on that. Add that to the list.
Catholic Charities is an option, but you have to be really persistent, and they're kind of overwhelming.
You're going to have to be persistent, and that's part of the problem here, because it's a problem. These cases, like for example, I mean, I've done one of all of these, even like an asylum case, which is very difficult. I mean, and I have a fair amount of experience. They're intensive cases, and like for example, so say you're a really established attorney, you're older than me, and maybe you're a great immigration, you need to speak Spanish most of the time to do your own deposition of the child. You know what I mean? And that's another hurdle a lot of times. So it's a problem. Oh, you don't have to speak Spanish. You can get a translator, or maybe a family member does it. I have found when I'm able to like speak it, and it's much better in terms of facilitating my workload, and I get a better deposition like the first time.
How much time does it take you to take with one case? Let's say somebody who is an asylum.
Yeah.
How much time would that take?
It takes a lot because what you're trying to do is, for asylum, it's very fact intensive. You're basically building a story, not a story, but you're building a case to fit the definition of they are fitting a particular social group is normally the category. And you, because people from this part of the world, particularly claiming gang-related violence claims as part of their particular social group, the case law is not great. You normally have to hire an expert, or what they call a country's condition expert. And this is somebody who, maybe they're an anthropologist, or they're somebody and they can speak about, yeah. I mean, so for my work, I belong to some listservs, and there's always like somebody, I don't know how many people are on them, but there's always somebody being like, I need a quiche, so an indigenous language from Guatemala speaker who can speak about domestic violence. And normally somebody will respond because it's a network that and probably they'll work on it, but the more difficult cases, particularly for asylum, it's very intensive, and that's why you're seeing less and less child asylum cases and more of this special immigrant juvenile status case. Because even though there's more paperwork for the SIJS, it's a better ability, a success rate, and it's also something, lawyers are good at paperwork and are more likely to be able to facilitate this than try to go into an asylum case, Yeah.
With the rocket docket,
Yeah.
what are the chances of getting a continuance for this person has appeared, did that first appearance, and was told to come back in 21 days?
Yes.
So what are the chances after those 21 days of getting a continuance?
It's not great. So the judges, they're not bad people. They have been given I clerked for a judge. They're given pressure from the chief judge and from other political, figures to prioritize certain things or to make certain decisions. And they have been told that they need to speed this particular part of the docket up. So I'm sure if there were extenuating circumstances, there's a particularly heartbreaking case, or this is a judge that's known to, for certain populations, you would get a continuance. But if they have been told to clear this element of their docket, they are less likely to give the continuances. I mean, which is problematic, I mean, and they're not doing anything illegal. But yeah, and so, I don't think for a while, the issue of legal counsel for unaccompanied kids, this was a line in this S744, the Comprehensive Immigration Reform. Like, people have known this is a problem, and it was not one of the more controversial elements of the Senate immigration bill. And now, I don't know when it'll be again that we'll get a law that'll even, make it that far that guarantees legal services for some of this population. Well, we started to make those appeals. So Clinic, the Catholic Legal Immigration Network, they have been doing great work, I think, in terms of working on that. So USCCB does a lot of the program side. So when I advocate, I'm a lawyer, I advocate for legal services, but I'm advocating a lot of times for the programs that we have and some of the policy issues about the population that we are seeing. Clinic works on some of the legal services, not just for this population, but others. There's been a call. The bishops have been pretty involved. For example, Bishop Mark Seitz of El Paso, he testified before the House Judiciary Committee in late June. He was the only opposition witness, meaning he was the only pro-unaccompanied child witness who is called to testify. And he has done a lot. He also, last week, went to the Artesia, New Mexico facility to highlight some of what's going on there. I think for certain bishops, I think this is very, very important. And we have a committee of migration, and the bishops that I have met that are on that committee are really dedicated. But it's one of many things within the bishops' conference. And I think sometimes, it's hard to balance all the time. Well, I know Clinic spoke to the Maryland judges about the rocket docket in Baltimore and issued a formal letter saying we're concerned and we want you to explain what you're doing. And I think that they're having the meeting coming up in terms of discussing, why they're pursuing this policy. Because again, on the timing for the rocket dockets, yes, the immigration court is backed up, but as I said before, these kids are only 11% of the entire docket. All right? And I don't know. I'm a lawyer. I find this stuff very complicated sometimes. And I can't imagine being a child, not having any legal training, and not speaking this language.
So if we knew people in our community, attorneys who were willing to be attorneys for these children or families,
Who should they contact? Catholic Charities or?
I think that they, should contact Catholic Charities. And if you have people that you know and they're not getting a good response, or even just in case, send them to me, and I will pester people that I know to be like, help. I know that there's a continuing legal education program on October 1st that the DC Bar is doing. I'll see what I can do. I don't know if there's still spots available. But like, for example, this CARE coalition that I mentioned, they help attorneys. They do this, they have one section that does exclusively the kids, and they will help, if you're an attorney but you're not an immigration attorney, they will help you do this. It's just a matter of, accessing the client, being made aware of the filing deadlines and what is required. Yeah, yes. So do you think that would be helpful if there was announcements at requesting pro bono legal services?
Yes.
I don't, okay.
Yes. Probably you could ask.
Huh? And how to get connected?
What to do, and with a little, to say, don't worry if that's not your specialty.
Thank you.
You're doing very important work, and we thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.